In our discussion before the present one, we were realizing some basic things about human beings. First, number one, that human beings, are gifted with a special faculty, the mind, which is always urging people to acquire knowledge. This is visible from the fact that man is asking questions. We said that we already see this in small children who constantly have one more question whenever all questions where they put before are already answered. In this adventure of asking and search, the primary concern is the question, what is the meaning of my existence? Is there any meaning or not? This is a very crucial question because somehow being aware, being thinking creatures, being in entities which are confused quite often, we must find the very sense of our being here. This is not assuming that already there is sense. Perhaps existence is meaningless. But the search for meaning is essentially a human search. Ultimately, whatever we do with awareness, whatever we pursue, whatever we love or hate, it's because we see some sense, some meaning in this and that, and so on. But here, when it comes to the question of God's existence, we are asking a very crucial question related to the meaning. It is the most profound question a human mind can actually develop, because depending on the answer, my situation here in this life will be very essentially changed, radically developed, perhaps in new direction. Therefore, we stress the fact that man being aware not only of time but also of eternity is always searching for some fundamental answers. If God exists, that's one possibility, then my life can have eternal meaning. Because in case we would come to the conclusion that de facto there is the ultimate ground, the first cause, the source of all existence, or in more religious language, creator, then we have a very strong pointer to the fact that perhaps the phenomenon of religion is not empty. The question, therefore, we are here analyzing is very essential to any normally developed human being. It does not imply, of course, that we will have a positive answer or negative. We must follow wherever the argument leads, no matter where it leads. And in this context, we realized also the importance of courage to think for yourself. the question of meaning of life, existence or non-existence of God, or perhaps even life after the physical, the body of the death of the physical body of man, is very intrinsic personal question. We know that almost to any problem, many questions, and quite often radically different questions, are being given. And in this chaotic collection of answers, a human being, a person, an individual, must find his or her own way. Therefore, there is a duty to search for meaning. There is a duty to master the courage to think for oneself. There is an absolute unavoidable duty to do one's utmost to answer the question. Now, man being free, and this was our last point, man being free, of course, we know that many people never ask such questions. They just live, so to speak, by routinely accepted values or cultural patterns of this situation, tribe, nation, state, town, village, into which they are born. They simply passively accept what is, so to speak, generally accepted, what they say. This undefined they seems to be like a force in a society commanding your submission, your beliefs. And it is very often the case that people simply live their lives in a very superficial way because they are preoccupied with living, doing this, doing that, going there, and so on. And they fill the emptiness of their existence with man-made meanings. Some of those meanings we also mentioned in our last session of reflections. Now, but we have to be here very strict, very logical, and we have to move, so to speak, step by step. So once we realize the importance, the crucial, essential importance of the question, whether we are only alone in this life, in this world, or whether there is some sort of the divine, we now see that if we want to be somehow in harmony with our own mind, our own inner peace, our own meaningful existence here and now, there is no escaping from finding the answer to the question which we were discussing. But when we ask the question, does God exist? We have first to be careful what we're doing here. We cannot prejudge any knowledge, any definite knowledge of God before, so to speak, even beginning the questioning. Why? Because then we will be jumping to conclusions. So the question to discuss now and analyze is, what is the content of the word God, G-O-D? Now we know, more or less, most people know, living in the Western cultures and around the world, what generally is meant by the word God. But it is a hazy concept, to say the least. Some sort of divine reality. Is God a what? Or is God a who? How do we know? So the first step in our discussion, in our analysis here, will be acceptance of intelligibility of reality. In other words, the first beginning of serious reflection about the problem of existence of God will be a firm statement on the fact that reality is intelligible, that there is real possibility to reach the truth about such crucial, fundamental questions. We assume the intelligibility of reality. And this is not a philosophical assumption, neither a scientific assumption, although both are rooted in it, but it's also the simple pre-scientific, natural acceptance of the dynamism of the human mind towards understanding reality, conditions in which I am born, assuming that my mind is a genuine tool, so to speak, in this enterprise of seeking the answer. Because if we don't assume this, then there is no sense of even posing the question. If the mind, the capacity to think, to know, is an illusion, then that's the story. That's the end of it. And this is why, therefore, many philosophical systems even deny the validity, legitimacy of posing the question about the final intelligibility of all reality. And here come many philosophical systems which simply say, no, you cannot really validly, rationally posit even the question. We have so-called radical empiricism, which, to put it in a nutshell, simply means only what I can see and touch and somehow measure, whether through a microscope, telescope, in a laboratory, on everyday experience, whatever is somehow perceivable by my senses, I can accept. But anything else, the so-called rational arguments, going beyond this visibility and tangibility, are not valid ways, because the human mind is too limited and too weak to simply be able to answer those questions. And therefore, about those systems, we shall not talk a lot. There is no doubt that after such philosophers like David Hume, like Immanuel Kant, and so many others, Feuerbach, Nietzsche, and so on, Camus and all, we are living in, so to speak, doubting era. And those denials of possibility of transcending what is given in the here and the now, reaching a reasonable, valid answer to the question about the ultimate source and ground and cause of all reality, of course, is doubtful for most modern people. Not a few scientists also belong to the same category. According to them, and I shall not use names here at this point, according to them, true knowledge is only possible when it can be somehow experienced through sense data, or prolongations of sense data. The prolongation of vision, of perceptual vision, telescopes, microscopes, and so on. And if such an attitude is accepted from the beginning, then naturally the question is not really reasonable even to begin with. Knowing all this, therefore, we from the very start must be careful to distinguish to develop, to elucidate, to explain the very first steps in our search. Such philosophies like, for example, the theistic philosophies, which are based on this faith and acceptance of the power of the mind to transcendence. Theism is the philosophy of all people who believe in some sort of the divine, whether it be the Platonic, the Aristotelian, the divine of Thomas Aquinas, and later on Descartes and so on, Leibniz, and then there is a belief, a true belief, which is also validated by experience and drawing the ultimate final conclusions from what is given in experiencing the real world in which we live. Theism, of course, is a Greek word coming from theos, which means God in Greek. Theism, the belief in some sort, mostly in a personal presence of the divine source of all absolute reality, source of all that exists. And as such, philosophy of theism is the fundamental rational aspect of religious beliefs. And I am talking here, when I say religious beliefs, I have in mind the theistic beliefs of Muslims, Christians, Old Testament Jewish or people, and some other denominations, but mainly those three: Judaism, Christianity, Muslim religion. We are not counting here Hinduism because it is doubtful whether Hinduism really is a belief in one God. It is very much inclined to accept polytheistic views. This is one, theism. The opposite, radically opposite position is atheism. Atheism means no God. And then we already, in our former reflections, we already said that an atheist must believe and accepts only what he considers the real is, and this real in his mind is matter in movement and nothing besides that. Anything that in any serious way I can point to and say it is, it somehow exists, for an atheist is some form, some kind of matter in movement only. All else is being reduced to matter in movement. Therefore, an atheist naturally cannot honestly accept any serious discussions on God, the divine, religion, or whatever which smells even with it. Simply because a convinced atheist must somehow consider all of those such phenomena as some sort of outgrown fascination with a delusion. We have recently the many books, atheistic books, coming out. The so-called new atheists, and the leader, perhaps not the leader, but one of the leading people here is Richard Dawkins, a biologist who wrote a big book, The God Delusion. Many other books are written. We know that in psychology and especially psychiatry, we had figures like one of the most popular, probably, Freud, Sigmund Freud, who was also a confessed atheist. Not to mention, once again, people like Sartre, Camus, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and so on and so on. Feuerbach, Marx, and all this. All those atheistic and atheistically inclined thinkers reject any kind of reality beyond the material or some force of matter. Naturally, most of the books, the atheistic books, most of those atheistic thinkers must try to convince other people, especially believers, that whatever we consider spiritual, immaterial, and so on, anything like this is reducible to matter in movement. This is why in science, the theory of evolution, which began with Charles Darwin in 1859 and in his famous book about evolution. This evolution, which was developed in biology, is then gradually accepted to all reality. All things develop and evolve. There is a general emergence of reality. And never is at any time accepted that perhaps there are different kinds of entities, different beings by nature radically distinct. All must be reduced to matter in movement only. Atheism does not necessarily have to be completely pessimistic, because atheists may develop their own, so to speak, man-made little world of meanings. It can be family life, children, science, development of mankind, conquest of nature, popularity, power over others, and so on, and so on, and so on. All those man-made meanings are precisely what they are. Man-made. That means man, so to speak, creates his or her own meanings. He is now the creator of meanings. And there is no other way. So when we are talking about atheists, we do not imply to blame people or speak in a condescending way about them and so on. Everyone has the right and absolute freedom to search for the final answers. And whether she or he comes to a valid solution or not, we must accept the human right to search, to find some answers, and to live accordingly. The next attitude which we have is so-called deism, very popular in 18th century. Most of the American founders of the Constitution and American nation, the fathers, so-called, were deists. Deists accepted existence of God, some sort of divinity. And this divinity created the universe. But then God was no more interested in what he did. And he let it go, so to speak, relinquished it to its own fate, and is no more interested in what's going on here. Some statements by Aristotle sound very similar to what I'm saying now. Deism, therefore, is saying, yes, there is some sort of divinity, some God, but he doesn't really care, because the deists rejected any kind of revelation, God's disclosure to humanity in some form or other. Now, any religion in a strict sense is based on such a disclosure of the divinity to humans. We call it revelation, comes from Latin, to reveal, unveil, to make something that was hidden now known. revelatio in Latin. These rejected it and rejected also any institutional religion whatsoever. So deism is in a sense, we could say that deism is a theistic attitude in philosophy, but mainly religiously speaking, indifferent. On the other hand, if you think about it for a while, you realize that a God who exists but doesn't care for humans, including myself, such a God is not very interesting phenomenon at all. If God really exists, if the divine is real, then a personal God, self-revealing God, is the God which a believer gladly accepts. Not, of course, blindly, but after long, sometimes very difficult and painful search. Contrary to all those statements, those philosophies mentioned so far, we have the attitude of skeptics. Skepticism is a disbelief in the ability of man to know, really. It's a sort of doubting almost anything. A skeptic is saying, there might be, there might not be, but we can never know. Skepticism is, in a way, a very comfortable way of living. Comfortable in a sense that the burden of serious responsibility for my existence here somehow is not so heavy on a skeptic, because he does not really take the demands of any serious religion in a very serious way. Bertrand Russell, among moderns, is a classic example of a skeptic. Although he is mentioned quite often as an atheist, but his own confessions, his own statements, point again and again to the fact that he was a skeptic. He did not really accept belief in God because, according to him, there is not enough evidence. Okay. Whatever this evidence he understood to be. Now, of course, we could go now at this point and again talk about Kantianism, Humism, David Hume's philosophy, idealism, phenomenalism, existentialism, all those isms which for the most part are inimical to even serious discussion of the existence of God. But for an unprejudiced human being, believing in the ability of the human mind and the power of the human mind to understand reality in the deepest sense of the word understanding, the question is very important, very central, and somehow we must face the problem. I think we by now already realize that a crucial problem here in those reflections right now will be, what do we mean by God? That's one. And the method, how to approach the problem. However, the method will be also dictated by the basic assumptions of any definite view of reality, any philosophy of reality, any understanding of reality. Anyone who approaches the problem in a serious way must accept the fact that skepticism, denial of the ability of the human mind to answer the crucial question of divine or not divine existence must be assumed from the very beginning. Otherwise, if before I even start to reflect on the topic, deny the possibility dogmatically, and this is important to remember, dogmatically, without any solid evidence, I simply say, no, we will never know. No, we cannot know. No, the human mind cannot enter into this transcending disquisitions and reflections and all this. So anyone who is a convinced Kantian, the believer in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, at least insofar as he denied the validity of metaphysics, anyone who is Humean and following the reflections of David Hume, and the modern existentialists, most of them, cannot really be serious in approaching the question here. Any pre-reflective knowledge is already assumed in any question whatsoever. Even in the most trivial question of a small child, when he is asking mother of all kinds of, why is this, who is that, why should I do this? This is already an indication that there is a dynamism towards knowledge present. It might be very weak, in a very primitive way, but it is there. The child knows not, and the child wants to know and asks because this child knows that there is some answer to the why, to the how, to the what for, what caused it, and so on. We know that in a way this whole universe in which we happen to exist is somehow connected, and all entities, all beings are somehow related dynamically to each other. The fact that children ask questions is obviously evidence. Anybody can test whether this assumption is true or not. It's enough to talk with a little child sometime. Before you know, you will be attacked with all kinds of questions. This is not a laboratory necessary evidence or scientific or not, but it is obvious reality. And this mind in the child is already there. It will grow, it will develop, it will go deeper and deeper into the questioning, and also transcend the here and the now of sense perception towards the final fundamental questions like, why am I here? Where I am going? What's going to happen with me? What should I do with my life? Is there anything else? Does really some sort of beginning exist in another dimension? The questioning cannot be dogmatically cut down, because then I somehow am similar to a man who wants to go up a tree and begins with throwing away the ladder. Now you'll never do that, because the ladder is precisely what you need to climb up the tree. Or if, say, some say army people who would say, okay, we have to cross the river. And then they say, let's begin by destroying the bridge. No, we would not take such behavior, a rational behavior in any way. It's a sort of mental suicide, because it is the desire to know. This is what we call here the dynamism, the inner dynamism, naturally given dynamism of the human mind, is a reality. By denying it, I simply don't change anything. I simply sentence myself towards ignorance. I sentence myself, I imprison myself within the circle of the here and the now. And I deny myself the most fundamental answers, the most fundamental search for the ultimate meaning of my existence. All philosophy is ultimately somehow done by man and for the good of man, because it gives an answer to the central question, central need in man, which we stressed in our former discussion here, the passionate desire to discover the meaning of my life here and now. Human beings cannot function properly and in a mature way unless they have an unspoken or specifically outspoken sense, discovery of why to go on doing things, why to do things, why to continue living, why to take all the bright moments and the shadowy moments in life. That there is some kind of dynamic confirmation. This dynamic confirmation of life is precisely this by which my existing, my doing, my thinking, my judging accepts meaningfulness of my being here. Now, resuming briefly what we said so far, first we must clearly be aware that we cannot form a clear concept of God at the beginning of our search. We have some conviction, some belief, some evidence of the dynamism of the human mind, and we start with the belief that reality is intelligible. And this intelligibility goes all the way from the naive questions of a small child through growing, maturing, through all my adventures of existence here, until I get old and disappear in death. This dynamism cannot be rejected from the beginning. Why? Because it is a dogmatic mental suicide. This is very important to remember. We also remember what we said last time, that in our search for the answers of the transcendent justification of reality, we must follow the argument wherever the argument leads. And this requires a stubbornness, determination, and a steady courage to go on searching, the courage to think for oneself, and therefore it is a kind of call to become lonely, become different. Because a searcher for the ultimate meaning may come to conclusions which will be ridiculed or rejected by very many other people. That's why the word courage to think for yourself is central. Timid people, weak people, usually are not creative individuals. That's one. And secondly, they really do not, so to speak, leave any mark on this world during their lives. Timid people are not creative in any true sense. Therefore, any healthy, mature person must also be a courageous individual. And by courage here we mean the determination to follow wherever the argument leads us, no matter what. At the very start, therefore, let's define our position. We begin with acceptance of the inner dynamism of the human mind. That is, the ability of the human mind to answer not only everyday questions, trivial questions sometimes, not only scientific questions, but also metaphysical questions transcending the direct, palpable, perceivable evidence of my senses. Transcending, meaning growing above and beyond what is given only to direct sensual experience. Therefore, we start with realizing and observing, first, number one, that there really exist things. And by things here, we take the idea of being. The concept and the notion of being will be fundamental in our thinking. Now, what is meant by this being? Being is whatever I can point to in some way and can say it is. Being is this that exercises the act of existence. Being is outside, so to speak, of nothingness. It has its own act of existing. It exercises the fact of being the great wonder of existence. When I point to a chair which is in front of me, I can touch it, can measure it, and so on, describe its style and all this, and it is a real chair. I am not sleeping, I am not drunk, I am not a somnambulic, but I am fully aware, conscious, and so on, and I touch it, I embrace it, I bang it, and I say, yes, there is a chair in front of me. And there, over there in the corner, there is a cat sitting and meowing. The cat is probably hungry. The cat is another entity. It is being too. Because there is nothing sitting there and meowing. There is a real, existing, living, perhaps hungry cat sitting in the corner of my room. I can go, I can touch it, keep it, perhaps feed it, and so on. It is another being. When I point to a tree in my garden, again, I am sure that I am not hallucinating. I am not under drugs. I don't have any special disease of my senses. I am fully aware. I am not sleeping, and so on. And I know that there is a tree. And when I say there is, I am saying being. And this being which I point to at this moment is a tree, a growing tree. Okay? In this sense, I can say it is. A galaxy is. The moon is. The earth, the globe is. And so on and so on. My friend is. My relatives are. But we realize immediately that all those enumerated things, realities, which I call beings, somehow are same, but also they are different. A piece, a stone, a dead stone, which I found at the seashore, is a being too. The cat, living cat meowing, is a being, and a philosopher or a scientist, like Einstein, let's say, or Plato or Aristotle, and so on, are also beings. But there is also a difference between them. A stone, a dead stone, is not Plato, or Aristotle, or even a cat, or even a tree, or even a flower. It is not, there is no life there. So we see here, on one hand, a common family of all that is somehow we call being, All reality, therefore, is beings. But on the other hand, we immediately realize that there is a very profound difference between different beings. They have the act of existence, and in this sense they are same. That's why we call them being. But they are also different. As mentioned before, the stone is not Plato, and the tree is not ashes, and the stone is not an elephant, let's say, or a camel in the desert. So we have one element which is common to all entities, the act of existing. That, on the basis of which I can call them beings. But also there is another element, the what they are. A stone has its own whatness. A tree, again, its own. Plato, again, its own, and so on. So we have this metaphysical composition of all realities which have both the act of existing in common, but also they have differences. And those differences define their whatness, the answer to the question, what is it? If I am not certain what I see, let's say, or what is visible in the mist there, the first question is, what is it? Or who is it? So we have the famous doctrine of the analogy of being. Analogy, coming from Greek, means simply similar dissimilitude. There is an element of similarity. Beings, they all have act of existence, and there is dissimilarity. A stone is not Plato, and a cat is not a tree, okay? So here we have differences. This fact that there is metaphysical composition in all entities out of the two is, we shall call it analogy. And there are different kinds of analogies, of course, and we shall not go into those different distinctions here. It's enough that we understand this fact. Although beings exist, they all are, but they also differ, and the difference is quite considerable. So if we talked about some sort of the divine, because finally our discussion is about it, then we must realize that this one thing, that God exists or not. Another question would be, what or who is, if he exists, is God? There are two different questions. I may have a very solid argument that de facto there does exist some sort of God. But so in this case, I am very much still in a haze. But if I know more about this divine God, especially after more and more research, thought, reflections, or perhaps a religious revelation, when a religion is based on God, somehow, in some way, communicating to the searching man, to searching people, then I can have a deeper, richer, and far more meaningful knowledge, insight into the question who or what this God possibly may be, if he exists, of course. We always are still at the moment in our reflections when we say if he exists or she exists. We are not judging here yet. We do not come to, as yet, we did not come to any definite conclusions about God. But we have already one platform obvious, the one which we discussed a few minutes ago. There really exist different beings. They all have existing. They all have the act of existence. In this sense, we can say they are real. They are not phantasmata. They are not deceptions. They are not hallucinations. When I see the chair in front of me and I am in a normal state of health, my senses are healthy, I am fully aware, I'm not sleeping, I'm not drunk or under drugs or under some sort of hypnosis or whatever, I can say there really is a chair in front of me. There really is a tree in the garden. I found this stone here on the seashore, and I have it right here in front of me. So we see here that what we call the cosmos, or the world, or reality in general, is a great, great family collection of many beings. That's one observation. The second observation, which is obvious, is that things have different essences, different natures, different whatnesses. As we said, a dead stone is not a living tree. And a living cat is not a chair. And so on. So, we have the second insight, that being, the idea, the concept, the content of the word being is analogical in nature, meaning that there is similarity between those beings, but also there is difference. And this difference is expressed in what we call their nature, their essence, or in an anglicized way, their whatness, because the question, it answers the question, what is it? What is it? Of course, this is obvious. Both realizations cannot be denied. Because man himself, the asking subject, the person, the inquirer, the searcher for meaning, putting those questions, analyzing them, is also a existing being. And among other beings is very sharply distinguishable from other entities, from stones, trees, animals, galaxies, clouds, and also other humans. My relatives, my friends, my colleagues at work, and so on. So, I also am a being. And consequently, we have here already a platform on which to begin our inquiry. The next thing is that we observe that beings are not passive, but each whatever is somehow is actively exercising its potencies, its abilities. There is a real causality in this universe. What do we mean by causality? A notion which is very much rejected in some circles nowadays, very much attacked by David Hume and so on. What is when you say something is caused, or something causes this and this? Everything somehow exists in activity. Even if I take the stone which I found at the riverside or seashore, it exercises some pressure on the ground. So it acts in some way. It is also acting upon by another. Let's say by the law of gravity, let's say, and so on. And here we have the explanation why we have things happening, why there is change in the universe. It is the result of activities of different entities mutually influencing each other and also being influenced by others. Causality is self-understandable concept. If, let's say, I'm sitting in my apartment and let's say I talk now to somebody, or listen to music or watch TV, or I'm just thinking in deep reflections, and all of a sudden the door of my apartment bangs with a big resounding bang. The immediate thing that happens in my mind is, what did it? What happened? Why was this big bang there? And I can inquire, perhaps somebody came in, perhaps there was a draft, perhaps this, perhaps that, and so on. But I will not just say, oh, well, it just happened, There is no explanation for it. There is a bang, that's it, Okay? No one really would be satisfied with such an answer. Or to give another example, suppose you bought a nice, beautiful mattress, You did your bed, clean, nice, and went to work in the morning and come back, and what do you see? A big, large hole in your mattress. And by the way, it appears to you it is burned out by some sort of fire. Now again, the question is, what happened? Why is this mattress damaged? Obviously, probably, somebody put fire to it. It did not just happen. If somebody would say, oh, no, yeah, I know you bought it yesterday. It was a beautiful mattress. But there was no hole, no burn, and now there is a hole. But don't ask why. It's there, period. Well, we would never really, no one having his senses together would really believe that such answer is a reasonable answer. That really is an answer. There is no answer in such, oh no, it just happened, you know. Things just don't happen. Now, in our days, in science, in astronomy, we have the famous theory of the Big Bang. It appears that all reality, which we today call the universe, all the big, tremendous millions of galaxies, and so on, all this was, in the very beginning, just a little spot which the astronomers, physicists call it the so-called singularity. A pinpoint, a very small. There was probably not yet much of space, time was not there yet. And Big Bang is what? It burst into existence. Galaxies start forming. It went through all kinds of changes, and we are living, as we know, in an expanding universe. Now the question is, how come that this Big Bang happened? And the obvious, the most reasonable answer here is to draw the conclusion that there must have been some active being, some activity, which, as a result, produced this Big Bang and development of the what we call today cosmos. Here, many scientists have still very big problems. But whatever theories may be developed of many universes, perhaps infinite number of different universes and so on, it does not solve the problem. The final answer is that there must have been some active being causing the Big Bang or the emergence of beginning of the universe, which through millions of years developed, part of which finally we humans are also here. Here, metaphysics, therefore, begins with those basic assumptions. Being as such, analogy of being, causality, intelligibility of reality. I am not dogmatically saying we cannot. I am following the dynamism of my mind as far as it can take me. The principle of non-contradiction, that's another element which has to be accepted from the beginning. The principle of sufficient reason is another one. And all this are elements of my mental basic apparatus with which I shall approach the question of the existence of some sort of the divine. Now, we are here talking, of course, about forms of knowledge. All this, from the small child's questioning to the mother about rather trivial things, to the great discoveries of scientists, to the great systems of the greatest thinkers in the history of mankind, and also the founders of the most living religions. All this is one and the same dynamic development, dynamism of the human mind in action of discovery. But we distinguish very clearly, especially nowadays, in our modern times, so-called, scientific knowledge, philosophical knowledge, common knowledge, or so-called common sense, and pre-philosophical, pre-scientific knowledge. And there is some ground for doing this. Science usually is restricted to the experienceable, through sense experience of some kind, with all help of the instruments, telescopes, microscopes, all the apparatus, which help the scientist to answer some aspect of the riddle of being, of reality here, within his own field. And depending on the question in science, we have different methods applied, and those methods have to be strictly accepted and practiced. There's a different approach of a biologist, another approach of a historian, still another of an anthropologist, and still another of a chemist or biochemist, and so on. Each science is a very specific, restricted field of man's, so to speak, trying to enter into the mysteries of what is, what exists. And a scientist within his field naturally believes that he is not daydreaming, he has not hallucinations or something of this sort, but he really is inquiring into reality in his own specific way. And those ways of inquiry, the methods applied, differ with different sciences, and even the way of asking has to be precisely in harmony with the form of questioning. Science, and we know that we are living in an era where science has definitely great victories and made progress in many areas, which in turn shapes our understanding of reality in ourselves. Scientific inquiries are very, so to speak, useful and very important, especially when it comes to shaping our worldview, but also our everyday life. After all, the average apartment, kitchen, and so on, cars, all this, all the gadgets facilitate human life to a great extent. Human energy is saved, human span of life is prolonged, and so on and so on. We conquered the moon. We are planning soon to be conquering Mars, the planet Mars. We already developed atomic weapons. We split the atom. We have also the production of electricity of atomic installments and so on. In other words, we expanded our understanding to a great extent because of progress in sciences, different sciences. However, those theories in science, although very essential and important, are changeable. Many things that were scientifically considered true centuries ago are not more accepted in our times. And we may be very sure that some theories, scientific theories that is, accepted today will be history to the next generation or the generation after the next one. Scientific theories are true, but in a very definite way. Clearly, we must understand they are not ultimate answers. Science gives us a lot of certitude, but never absolute. There always is a possibility that new discovery in some area will change the whole thing, or some aspect of this theory. Think, for example, about Einstein, about people like Mach, about Schrödinger, okay, or the atomic physicists and all that. Science is a step-by-step accumulated temporary understanding which is enriched by one generation after another. But it does not give us absolute truth. And this is essential to understand. This is not to disparage science. This is not saying, oh, science is not important. No, science is very, very important. But some aspects of the scientific theories are existentially not interesting or important for the average person. The fact, for example, that there are so many millions of galaxies, or perhaps more than this number, still more millions, is really not interesting or very much relevant to my life of every day, to my beliefs, and to my conscience, to my meaning, the meaning of my personal, unique existence here. In this sense, science is essential and important, but it is in many, many aspects of no interest to the particular human being. Science does influence human life, of course. But when it comes to the most fundamental questions, then we must move mentally beyond science even. And in this sense, philosophy is necessary, metaphysical search for ultimate truth, ultimate reality. So we come now to the question of philosophical knowledge. This is also part of the human dynamism, of human search. What is philosophy really? A philosopher is not predicting anything from the start. He simply assumes several things which we just mentioned here tonight. But he does not stop only with what a scientist can see, measure, weigh, and so on. He goes beyond the sense data only. He draws conclusions about the fundamental, ultimate intelligibility of all reality. In philosophy, what is important is not only physical science, but metaphysical reflections and search. Meta means beyond the physical scientific truth. A philosopher goes beyond it. He is searching for the final absolute data of the wherever human intelligibility can reach. And therefore, when we face a question like, does God exist, for example? Is there any sense in my life? All such fundamental, directly essential and important questions to me as a human, we must go far beyond the so-called scientific data. Not neglect them. A philosopher must know what happens in most sciences of his time. But he realized all the time that scientific theories are changeable. That in science we get some truths, but we can never have the fundamental, absolute, final answer. This is beyond and above scientific knowledge. A scientist in his own field may be a genius. Let's say an Einstein, a Schrödinger, Planck, and so on. Many of them. They are real geniuses. But he is also a human being. In other words, as a scientist, he may have tremendous knowledge within his field of inquiry, within his specific this science. Okay, astronomer, physicist, biologist, anthropologist, and so on. As a human being, however, he also, being human, he also needs some inquiry about the ultimate fundamental questions. In other words, as a human, he is interested very much in the problem whether belief in God is reasonable or not. This is the kind of questioning which his spirit, his very human nature demands. And as a scientist, he cannot, from his scientific only knowledge, he cannot answer those ultimate questions. Why? Because those questions are not part of his scientific methods. What the scientist of any kind needs desperately is that the universe somehow is not chaotic, the universe displays a great degree of stability, regularity, or else science would be impossible. If there would be sheer chaos, if there would be no scientific possibility of knowing, the word science would be simply empty. All scientific inquiry is based on the presumed existence of regularities, or call them laws of nature, which he tries to decipher in his own way. But we must remember that, I repeat again, that a scientist is also a human being. And as a human being, he also is subject to the desire to get some reasonable answer to those ultimate fundamental questions. One central question among those fundamental questions is the question of whether the divine exists or not. This is the subject of our discussions here. It is therefore essential that we distinguish those two ways of knowing, although really it is one same dynamism of the human mind in both dimensions. The difference comes in when we talk about the method of inquiry. But a scientist, a metaphysician, a philosopher, even a small child, display and live because they need the desire, as Aristotle said, all men by nature want to know, desire knowledge. Without knowledge, there is no living, there is no discovery of sense in life, and there is even a possibility of despair and complete radical denial of any kind of sense. Some of the existential thinkers, let's say Albert Camus, some others, I don't want to go into names at this moment, actually openly preach that life is absurd, that there really is no any meaning in life. Man is born not knowing why, there is no sense. Man is simply living not knowing why, and he disappears not knowing why and what for. Atheism is the attitude which is spreading more and more in our times, 21st century. The beginning of 21st century. And if somebody is really faithful to his atheistic views, then he must, of course, acknowledge the fact that man is really a tragic figure, in a sense that he desires answers, but those answers really are not present, not acceptable, not there. And in this sense, the confession of absurdity by some of those thinkers is really not really a great, joyous, so to speak, news. Not really a good news. Although in some books the new atheists, about them we shall talk later also in our discussions here and our reflections, the so-called new atheists, deny this. They say that since religion, belief in God, and consequently religion, is really false, is a delusion, a belief in God mainly, a delusion, then naturally it is a evil, it is a burden, it is something that should not be. And if somebody is really, really, truly convinced, there is a very great doubt whether the tolerance of what others think, even if they believe in God, will last for a long time. Because we can have all kinds of individuals who come to power in different centuries in history who did not acknowledge any limit to their hunger for power and destruction of anyone who was somehow against them, their thoughts, their ideologies, sometimes fanatical, nonsensical theories. And again, the Nazi movement comes to mind, the Stalinist regime in the Soviet Russia, and some excesses of the contemporary even governments are a common knowledge. This only puts more gravity to the seriousness of our questioning. I don't know who, I don't remember, but somebody said that anyone who doesn't want to have one Lord God will have many tyrants in his life. On the other hand, we stand on the belief that everybody, every human being is entitled to his own beliefs, his own way of living, his own vision of reality. It is his natural, so to speak, gift. And tolerance, mutual tolerance, especially in societies of this kind, like in America, let's say, the United States and so on, where many, many people of different culture are there, beliefs, traditions and all that are all together. Tolerance is the only human way of living. Tolerance is necessary, and we must all throughout all those little, all through those our reflections here, be constantly aware that no matter whether people agree with us or not, what counts ultimately is the vision of truth. When it comes to other people, we must be tolerant. To be tolerant does not mean that I agree with someone. No, precisely, I do not agree. I may be really very, very deeply opposed, let's say, to some beliefs. But because they are human beings who have those beliefs, and as long as they do not become vicious and deadly in their behavior and fanaticism, it is an absolute moral imperative to be tolerant to other views. So now, there is one more question we would like to say a word or two tonight about. Very many people believe that somehow science is hostile to belief in divinity, in God. Some young people especially, and also middle-aged people, they would say, oh well, those beliefs on of all times, medieval times, belief in God, religions, all those things were good, perhaps, at the time. But now we are living in times of science. Science has obvious results, great, glorious results. Therefore, we do not acknowledge any kind of knowledge, but also only scientific knowledge. And therefore, they simply dismiss any serious talk about the fundamental ultimate questions. Is science hostile, therefore, inimical to the question whether God exists? Not at all. Science is one way of knowing. And as we noticed already, limited way of knowing, changeable way of theorizing, and so on. And the questioning of a philosopher, a metaphysician, about the meaning of life, beginning of the universe, the nature of reality, possibility of God's existence, and so on. All those questions are deeply human. They were asked thousands and thousands of years ago, and they will be asked as long as humans will be here, present on this here. So, the mythology, in a bad sense of the word, that science is inimical, hostile to believe in God, to religion, is simply false. It simply is a lie. Science is a way of knowing, it's enrichment. But so is, in a deeper sense, philosophy and the ability to transcend the here and the now of the scientist towards the ultimate, final, and possibly the eternal. It is one and the same, as we said already, dynamism of the human mind towards knowledge. In our next discussion or reflections, we shall talk some more about different kinds of arguments which we have, which are valid in different areas of human knowing. Especially we shall discuss the importance of logic, basic principles, and the openness to the possibility of the eternal. We shall distinguish between different kinds, different aspects of one and the same dynamic reaching towards knowing in human life.